For over 4 decades, Richard Thomas carried a story that he never shared. Not in interviews, not in memoirs, not even when fans begged for behind-the-scenes secrets from the Waltons. It wasn't scandalous, but it was deeply personal. And for a man who had grown up in front of millions, it was the one truth he chose to keep to himself. Until now. At 74 years old, the actor who became a household name as John Boy Walton finally opened up about the one woman who changed his life in ways even Hollywood couldn't script. She wasn't a co-star in the usual sense. She was something more, a quiet force who saw through the lights and cameras, straight into the heart of a boy trying to become a man under the weight of sudden fame. This isn't just a tribute, it's a confession. A truth that Richard Thomas says he's finally ready to share about the person who shaped him not only as an actor, but as a human being. And once you hear what really happened between them, you'll never look at the Waltons the same way again. Before the fame, before the Emmy, and long before he became America's favorite big brother, Richard Thomas was simply a quiet, observant boy growing up in the heart of New York City surrounded by art, movement, and discipline. His parents weren't just performers, they were dancers with the legendary New York City Ballet, and they ran their own school, the New York School of Ballet. For most kids, bedtime stories involved fairy tales. For Richard, it was rehearsals, music, and the sound of pointe shoes on hardwood floors. From the outside, it might have looked like a perfect setup for a dance career. But even as a child, Richard felt something pulling him in a different direction. Not center stage with pirouettes, but storytelling. Emotion, connection, acting. At just 7 years old, while most kids were learning to read aloud in class, Richard made his Broadway debut in Sunrise at Campobelloa, major production about Franklin D. Roosevelt's early battle with polio. It wasn't just a role, it was a moment, one that hinted at something rare. He didn't act like a child actor. He felt like the character, and directors noticed. Audiences noticed. Even veteran actors were surprised by the emotional depth of this small, serious kid with a calm voice and intense eyes. By the early 1960s, he was already appearing on television soap operas like A Flame in the Wind and The Edge of Night. While other kids his age were worrying about homework, Richard was quietly building a resume that would rival some adults. But none of that prepared him for what came next. Because the moment the Waltons came into his life, everything changed instantly. When the Waltons premiered in 1972, it was meant to be a quiet little family drama. No one expected it to explode into a cultural phenomenon or to make a teenage Richard Thomas one of the most recognizable faces on American television. Practically overnight, he went from the boy on Broadway to the heart of millions of living rooms. As John Boy Walton, Richard wasn't just playing a character, he was embodying an ideal, honest, intelligent, sensitive, grounded. He became the voice of moral clarity in a world that was rapidly changing. And for audiences, he was John Boy. But for Richard, the pressure of becoming a symbol for an entire generation was quietly suffocating. While his performance seemed effortless, the reality behind the scenes was more complicated. He was still young, navigating the complexities of fame, long work hours, and the weight of expectation. Everywhere he went, people assumed he was just like the thoughtful writer he played. But Richard was still figuring himself out. The demands of the role were intense. The emotional scenes, the public appearances, the expectation to always be on, to always be good. And unlike most teenage actors, Richard didn't get a chance to stumble through adolescence in private. Every misstep had an audience. Every bad day was filmed. He never complained, but behind his calm, collected demeanor, the strain was real. And that's when someone unexpected stepped in. Not a producer, not a director, but a woman who had been in the industry long enough to recognize when a young actor was quietly drowning. Her name was Ellen Corby. And she saw everything. Ellen Corby was already a Hollywood veteran when the Waltons began. To most, she was simply Grandma Waltona, stern but loving matriarch with a heart of gold. But to Richard Thomas, she quickly became something much more. She didn't come in with fanfare or force. She didn't offer lectures or long-winded advice. What she gave was far more valuable: stability, presence, quiet strength. While others on set were focused on schedules, ratings, and scripts, Ellen watched the people. She noticed the toll fame was taking on the young cast, especially Richard. And without asking, she stepped into a role no one had assigned her: protector. She never treated him like a kid, never talked down to him. Instead, she treated Richard as an equal, as someone worthy of respect and honesty. That simple act of recognition changed everything. In an industry where child actors were often overlooked or patronized, Ellen gave him something rare: dignity. When a scene pushed him emotionally, she was there with a glance that steadied his nerves. When the fame became overwhelming, she gave him space to breathe. She led not with words, but with grace. A quiet hand on the shoulder, a calm look that said, "You've got this." To the outside world, theirs was just a working relationship. But within the walls of that set, Ellen Corby became a kind of surrogate grandmother, not just in script, but in spirit. And what she gave him during those years, Richard would carry for the rest of his life. While fans adored their on-screen chemistry, no one really knew what was happening between Richard Thomas and Ellen Corby when the cameras stopped rolling. That was by design. There were no tabloids following them, no interviews revealing their off-screen connection. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't performative, it was private and profoundly real. Richard never felt the need to publicize their bond, maybe because it was too sacred to explain. Ellen had a way of making you feel safe without saying much. And Richard, a naturally introspective soul, valued that more than any spotlight. During the most emotionally demanding scenes, she became his anchor. He'd later admit that some of his most heartfelt performances came not from the script, but from reacting to her, watching the quiet emotion in her eyes, feeling her presence beside him. She believed in his talent, but more importantly, she believed in him. She encouraged him not just to act, but to understand, to empathize, to reach deeper. And when she praised him, it wasn't casual. Ellen didn't hand out compliments easily, so when she told him he'd done something right, it stuck. It meant something. For years, Richard downplayed just how much she meant to him. Maybe out of modesty. Maybe out of the emotional weight that came with trying to describe someone who had quietly shaped the way he saw the world. But the bond they shared, subtle, unspoken, and unshakable, was one of the most defining relationships of his life. And it was about to be tested in a way neither of them could have predicted. In 1976, everything changed. Ellen Corby suffered a massive stroke that left her struggling to speak, move, and perform. For most actors, that would have marked the end. For Ellen, it became something else entirely: a fight to return. Not just to the show, but to herself. Richard Thomas was no longer a teenager by then. He'd already begun to branch out in his career, exploring new roles and challenges. But when he heard about Ellen's stroke, something pulled him back, not out of obligation, but out of love. He began visiting her during recovery, often quietly, often without fanfare. Sometimes, he would just sit with her. Other times, he'd read aloud books, scripts, anything to give her the rhythm of language again. Seeing someone once so sharp and commanding now struggle with basic words was devastating. But what struck Richard wasn't the loss, it was her determination. Ellen didn't want pity. She didn't want anyone's sadness. She wanted to get back to work, to be Grandma Walton again. And somehow, she did. Her return to the Waltons after the stroke wasn't flawless. She spoke more slowly, her movements were more measured. But the fire was still there, the same grace, the same unwavering presence that had once grounded Richard in his toughest moments. Only now she was teaching him something even deeper: resilience. "She taught me what courage looked like," Richard would later say. "She didn't ask for sympathy, she wanted dignity." In those moments, watching her fight through recovery, watching her reclaim her voice, Richard understood something no acting class could teach: that real strength isn't loud. It's steady, silent, stubborn. And Ellen embodied all of it. Long after the final episode of The Waltons aired, and long after Ellen Corby passed away, her presence never really left Richard Thomas. It lingered not as a shadow, but as a compass. In every emotionally charged scene he's done since, in every young actor he's quietly mentored backstage, In every role that required more heart than dialogue, Ellen's influence was there. Subtle, steady, unmistakable. She didn't just teach him how to act, she showed him how to listen, how to lead without demanding attention, how to give without expecting praise. Richard has often spoken about the importance of grounding, especially for young actors caught in the chaos of early success. And whether he says her name or not, it's clear who gave him that grounding first. He never forgot the way Ellen would gently guide with just a look, the way her silence could say more than a paragraph, the way she never compromised her standards but always made space for others to rise to them. Now, in his 70s, Richard finds himself playing the kinds of roles she once did: the wise parent, the quiet force, the emotional anchor in someone else's story. And with each performance, he carries her forward. Sometimes, he says, when he's about to deliver a difficult line, he hears her in his head. Not words, just a feeling, a reminder to slow down, to feel it, to get it right. Because for Richard Thomas, Ellen Corby wasn't just a co-star. She was the standard, the lesson, the legacy. And even now, she's still guiding him just like she always did. For decades, Richard Thomas said almost nothing about Ellen Corby beyond the usual praise. Interviews came and went, articles were written, but the depth of their connection remained locked away untouched, unexplored. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was too important. Richard has always been a thoughtful man, careful with his words, intentional with what he shares. And when something matters that deeply, it's not always easy to talk about it without cheapening it. In truth, their bond wasn't built for headlines. It didn't fit into sound bites or television specials. It was quiet, sacred, personal. He didn't want to turn it into a public tribute just because people expected it. He didn't want to explain her influence like it was a bullet point in his career. It was bigger than that. For years, the emotion was too close to the surface. Every time he thought about speaking on it, he felt the weight of those memories, the glances, the encouragement, the hand on his shoulder, the hospital visits, the pain of watching someone so strong slowly fade. So he kept it close, held it like a gift that didn't need to be opened in front of an audience. But as time passed, something shifted. Maybe it was age, maybe it was perspective, maybe it was the growing realization that his story, his values, his emotional core were deeply rooted in everything she gave him. And keeping quiet, he realized, didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like omission. So he finally decided to speak. Not to reframe his career, but to honor the one person who shaped it more than anyone knew. In the world of television, relationships often feel scripted temporary bonds formed for the sake of the camera, then quickly forgotten. But Richard Thomas and Ellen Corby were the rare exception. What they built wasn't just chemistry, it was connection. Quiet, lasting, real. For years, Richard kept that part of his story to himself, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. Because some people leave a mark so deep, it takes a lifetime to find the words. Now, with the clarity that only age can bring, he's finally spoken. And what he shared isn't gossip or nostalgia, it's something far more powerful. Gratitude. Gratitude for a woman who didn't just share scenes with him, but shaped the way he performed them. Gratitude for the gentle way she guided him through the chaos of early fame. Gratitude for the courage she showed when life tried to silence Heron, for the way she never let it. She mattered, he said simply. And I never want to forget that. In the end, the truth Richard Thomas finally shared wasn't some buried secret or backstage drama. It was something purer, something rare. It was love. And for anyone who's ever had a mentor, a protector, or a quiet force in their corner, his story is a powerful reminder. Sometimes, the people who shape us most aren't the ones who shout. They're the ones who stand quietly beside us, steady and strong, until we finally realize just how much we owe them.